Welcome to the tutorial video for the website indexesiq.com, which is an educational website for long-term index investing. In this tutorial video, I'd like to give you a brief overview over the long-term performance pane on the website, which is a tool to plot long-term risk and performance analysis charts. Let's start with the chart we're seeing here. This is the long-term performance of the S&P 500. Let's take a look at some of the functions down here. Starting with some very simple functions, you can plot the performance in index values or in percent. You can plot it on a log scale or a linear scale, and you can switch on or off some of the performance statistics in the window up here. Now let's go to some of the more interesting functions here. So at the moment, I'm plotting the history of the performance. Now I can add a bear and bull market analysis by clicking on this button. Now what you see here are the bear and bull markets in the S&P 500 defined as periods in time where the index was moving by at least plus 20% or minus 20%. Might be easier to see if I look at a shorter period like 30 years. And here you see the cyclical behavior, so the bull and the bear markets of the S&P 500. A similar analysis is this one, where I look at historical crises. So here we see in dark gray the historical recessions, and in light gray we see crisis situations such as the First World War, the Second World War, etc. Another interesting chart to look at is the underwater plot, where you can see how long you've been underwater after the last peak, when the market turned to a bear market. Now this chart shows you that the longest time underwater in the S&P 500 was 25 years, which was after the crash in the end of 1920s. But this is not even inflation adjusted. So you might ask the question, well, what about adjusting this for inflation? Now let's do that quickly. I have selected here the S&P 500 and I'm doing inflation adjustment, and now I'm clicking on the plot. And now you see inflation adjusted, the time underwater, so the time to recover losses after the 1929 crash, was actually 29 years, so even longer, because you have to make up for inflation as well. Another interesting chart is the so-called overlay chart, which shows you yearly performances of the S&P 500, and you see the strongest performance year up here, the weakest down here, and then the most recent year as a blue line in the middle, and all the other years are kind of this gray zone in the back. Another interesting chart is the distribution of returns of the S&P 500, and here we're looking at the distribution of weekly returns, but I can change that by using this function here. I can look at the distribution of monthly returns or quarterly returns or even yearly returns. And I can also switch on the value at risk for that. So let's say the 95% value at risk, and you see this is the 95% value at risk when I use quarterly returns or monthly returns or weekly returns. I can also look at period returns. So these are the different years and how the S&P 500 performed in these years. And finally, I can look at the risk return chart. So where you see the volatility versus the average long-term return. This is a bit boring chart because it only shows one index. So let's add another chart to this one. Let's add the Nasdaq. I select Nasdaq, I click on Add to Plot, and now I see the Nasdaq had higher average returns over the study period, but it also had higher volatility. And when I have two time series in the plot, I can click on the scatter plot, which basically shows me the correlation between these two indexes. So the returns of the Nasdaq versus the returns of the S&P 500. And again, I can look at this correlation for weekly returns, monthly returns, or quarterly returns. And you always see kind of the R square, the beta, and the correlation of the correlation analysis. So that was a summary of these plotting functions. And here's the plot of the S&P 500 versus the Nasdaq again. Now, let's take a look at this menu bar on the left-hand side here. First of all, I can switch this bar on or off. We can make it disappear and we can make it appear. Now, if you want to create a new plot, you have to go through a 3-step process. So first you choose the type of index you want to plot. You want to plot equity indices, currencies or precious metals, interest rates or macro indicators, which is like GDP or inflations. Then you can make adjustments. Adjustments meaning you can basically convert an index into another currency. For example, you can plot the S&P 500 in euro terms to take the position of a euro investor, or you can inflation adjust it, GDP growth adjust it, or you can divide it by another index. And then you can plot it, add to a plot, you can remove it from a plot, or you can look at recent plots. Let's look at some examples. Let's say I'm taking the AEX index of the Netherlands, and I want to plot it in relation to the benchmark of the Eurozone, which is the stock 600. So I'm taking the AEX and I divide it by the stock 600, and I'm saying, let's plot this. So this is just the percentage relationship between the AEX and the stock 600. Now I could say, let's do the same for the German DAX. So it's the DAX. Again, now I'm dividing it by the stock 600. And let's add this to the plot. Now we see the relative performance of both of these indexes versus the benchmark for Europe. And I can easily take one of these plots away. I can switch that DAX back on or off as I like. Let's take another example. Let's take, for example, again, the S&P 500. I want to plot this one. Oh, sorry, I don't want any adjustments here. But now I want to compare it to, for example, how interest rates behaved over the time period. So I'm going interest rates, and let's just plot the 10-year treasury yields next to it. So I'm adding the plot, doing this a log. And now we see on the left-hand side is the S&P 500. On the right-hand side is the treasury yield at the same time period. So these are just some examples how we can create plots. There is a collection of more examples down here. So you click on this one, and there's some really interesting examples that give you an idea of what type of plots you can create. One of my favorite ones is this one, where you see the long-term performance, inflation adjusted, of the S&P 500 versus gold over more than 100 years. And you see all the different recessions and wars in between, and the periods how they performed. Or another example plot, an interesting one, is when I tried to compare some of the return distribution. This is this one. So here I look at the distribution of returns of the S&P 500, the Nasdaq and the Russell, and you see that, for example, the return distribution of the Nasdaq is more extreme. And again, I can switch between weekly, monthly, and quarterly returns, and you see for quarterly returns how skewed some of these distributions are. I hope this video gave you a good overview of the different plotting functions that this website offers. For more information, please visit the manual on the website or watch some of the other videos. Now, thank you for watching, and goodbye.